Hi, everyone. My name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I'm the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice. Thanks so much for tuning in. For the June 2025 edition of the TWP COP newsletter, I have the pleasure of speaking with Micol Martini, who is a senior expert and technical lead on environmental governance and conflict with the Worldwide Fund for Nature International, or WWF. And while there, she works on strengthening understanding of political economy and conflict dynamics across the conservation space. Before joining WWF, Micol served for over a decade and as an advisor working on conflict and governance with the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And before that, DFID, the Department for International Development. Her last role with FCDO was as a senior mediation policy lead, and her earlier work at DFID focused on the political settlement in Somalia. Previously, Micol had served with the United Nations Development Program in South Sudan and Sudan, working on the South Sudanese transition to independence. And she has also worked with several other international organizations on advocacy, as well as research related to governance, rights, and fragility. So welcome, Micol. Thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure.
Well, thanks for having me, Lena.
Great. So perhaps we can start with asking you about your personal trajectory, about embracing the centrality of politics in your own work. I suppose within FCDO, but maybe even earlier. So if you can tell us a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you've sort of highlighted, I've been really fortunate to work on governance and conflict issues in a lot of different really fascinating places and with some really great organizations. So I'm not sure if there was sort of one set trajectory per se, but maybe what would be kind of more interesting or more helpful would be to sort of draw from an example that I think is the kind of thing that maybe drew me to this space. So for quite a lot of my work experience, and in particular working in my time with DFID and then FCDO, I worked on Somalia, which is a really fascinating and brilliant context. And when I was there, one of many really fascinating governance issues that I sort of got stuck into, along with others, was this issue of urbanization. And in particular in Mogadishu, which is the capital, but this is a sort of issue across the country. And I think the thing to say about urbanization in Mogadishu is it's actually not really that different from a lot of places in the region. You've got demographic shifts and urban growth and a youth bulge and informal settlements. But I think what was really interesting there, in particular, was this sort of inextricable link between the national elite bargain, which created this really tenuous geographic division of spoils along clan lines, and then the perpetuation of urban marginalization and land capture. And that kind of resulted in a sort of fascinating quandary in that it led to the commodification of IDPs and this sort of incentive to retain or even potentially create IDPs. And this is a messy
IDPs, internally
displaced people. Yeah, okay. Exactly. Sorry. And I just bring that up, and it's a messy example, but I think this is there's something fascinating about this context and the creation of incentives that are just very not great outcomes. And I think, this is not at all unique to Somalia or necessarily my experience there, but I think this kind of tension is just fascinating. And I've seen it replicated time and time again, pretty much everywhere I've worked, but also everywhere I've lived. And I think that is really what, is the thread throughout the things that I've done. So, I think what's fascinating about that kind of a power lens and that type of distortion of power is, there's a level of recognition of the messiness of these kinds of change processes. And I think it gives a sort of a really interesting and honest starting point to unearth competing ideas and values and trying to constantly toggle back and forth between them. So in that example, do we value the stability of the elite bargain, or, how do we balance that across the imperative for inclusive urban growth? And in my experience, that matters, like for people's lives, that matters in reality. Like we all live with some level of dissonance between the ideas and values that are imbued in policy and then our like lived reality. And so I think this political lens, we see it in development, but we see it in our own lives, and now I see it in conservation as well, is this forcing function to think about these trade-offs. And I think you've said this before, but this idea that not all things not all good things go together, and try to have that discourse around that.
Well, that's a really wonderful segue, perhaps to ask you a little bit about WWF International. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what the organization does and what your role is there, elaborating on this remit that you have around political economy, and also tell us a little bit about how you see this concept of what you're talking about, politics, resonating with the work of WWF. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, WWF it's a conservation organization. And so its mandate is really working behind the 2030 goals to try to safeguard and protect nature and impede climate change. It works on biodiversity loss. It works on the global finance, sort of the structure of finance. It works on like the sort of policy landscape, on food systems, on climate. So it works sort of across the spectrum of climate and environment issues. And it does that in, I think I want to say it's over 90 countries. So it's a big networked organization. And it's been around for a long time. And I guess within that, what we're trying to do is to help our offices, to the point we just made, to understand like some of those power functions that are working at odds with these goals, right? I think we recognize that people aren't degrading the environment and perpetuating climate change for fun. Usually there's an interest behind it, or an interest not to engage in it. And I think trying to understand that in the context where we work is really imperative to trying to shift some of those. So that's sort of what we're doing. And my role is really to try to help our offices have the tools that they might need to understand that in the context where they work, whether that's sort of fragile, conflict affected state, or working with these vested interests or sort of political economy interests. And we do a lot in particular about thinking about the nexus with sort of crime and corruption as well.
Can I ask you something about this? Because sometimes there's the idea, and I don't know how real this is in the experience of WWF, but there's the idea that some work around conservation in particular, but perhaps broader environmental issues, are rather technical and very focused on the technicalities of what is involved, and sort of kind of completely separate from any grounding on governance or deeper issues of politics and power. How true do you think this is for WWF? And if you have seen a shift, how would you describe that shift?
Yeah, I mean, like every institution and organization in this, I think this is like an evolution. So I also have to say I'm relatively new to WWF, but I think historically, yeah, that there has been probably a more technical or technocratic approach to conservation, and more maybe focused on the immediate like manifestation of a problem. And I think that maybe is fair, but I feel like even in the time that I've been there, and certainly like even predating my time, that there's been a real evolution in the discussion, and really thinking about both how conservation in these contexts, the imperatives of conservation are like coming out of political power-based challenges, as well as understanding that we work in context with people that are powerful and powerless, and we have a role to play in that system. And I think there's a lot more recognition of that. Some, we're a big diffuse network. Some of our offices have worked in really hard governance contexts, and so for a while I think have been really savvy to that and trying to think about those dynamics and the way that they work. And I think for others it's like sort of like they're on that pathway. And I do think that there is much more, I think there's a really broad commitment to really think about the sort of social and political role we play in these contexts, and to start to think about how to bring together, more positive goals for human well-being as well as for the environment. But I do think it's still a trajectory that's being developed. And then there's, maybe we'll talk about this, but it's I would say there's sort of the step of like recognizing and the step of figuring out how to unpack it, and then the doing. And the doing part is really hard.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you about if you can give us a sense. Before, you said that you started working there not too long ago, so maybe you can let us know when you started. But when you got there, what kinds of thinking, working politically things would you say the fund might have been doing already, both on the thinking part, but also more on the applied side of taking insights from politics and governance into account in tailoring the work that they wanted to do in this space?
So I joined 3 years ago, which now that I say that doesn't sound so short, but it feels short. And before I got there, actually my predecessor, who is another ex-DFID advisor and very brilliant.
Really? Oh, how funny. Yes. That's so funny.
You can speak to him too, because he's also like just fantastic. But he really led the charge in developing this framework we have on political economy analysis and getting that in place. And I think he did such a great job in making something like really clear and accessible. And also, the team there, and he rolled out like a sort of short course, which is really great. So I think that there was some work on that front underway already. And then I think we had, like I said, there's some offices, we had our that are, at that time we had, our colleagues in Brazil working under the Bolsonaro administration, just really thinking very much about how to be an ally to local communities and indigenous people, and to deal in a really constrained governance environment. So I think that was there not necessarily because like anybody sort of said, look, this is a political economy analysis framework, but because there was just the imperative, right, to work in that way. But it wasn't, and I think also just a general like commitment to working towards a sort of more inclusive and like locally led form of conservation has been there for a while. And now, so I think since I've come in, I really just focusing more on that like uptake side, because I think one of the things that I found is like, there is still that question of, okay, we like this and we want to get it, but it's not, I think it's still really challenging.
How do you, you mentioned that this person from FCDO used the framework and did some trainings and all of this. How would you say that you socialize this framework across different offices that you work with and potentially with partners? And how do you feel, what do you think is most effective in trying to do that socialization of the framework and of a way of thinking, really?
So, I guess like since I joined, or what had he done previously, or?
No, with you now at the helm of this. Yeah.
So I think we were trying a lot of different things, and I would say it's somewhat experimental. So you've got to sort of throw that out there. So I would say that one thing I think we really want to focus on is, well, maybe there's sort of a few buckets of things. So one is like, do we have the right tools and frameworks? Like, are our resources right? Are they easy to use? Are they clear? Are they, sufficiently rigorous? There's that piece. I think then there's a piece about like process. Like, is it clear how this stuff, these tools, connect to the day-to-day jobs that people are doing? Are they part of do people like naturally make the link of, oh, I'm going to do this when I develop a strategy, or, when I do my MEL framework, or, when I design a program, are they brought together in that way? And then and all this is like tied together, but then the third is like capacity, right? Then do people have the skills and the knowledge to do it every day? And I think on the tools piece, like we had this great PEA framework that my predecessor had developed. I think to your question about dissemination, like it was and is still kind of growing in terms of how much people know about it and we're using it. And there are some kind of complementary gaps we're trying to sort of fill now around conflict sensitivity. I think we've talked about that before. On the piece around bringing it into core processes, like I think there's just like an experience gap, right? Where we'd have like a team do a political economy analysis and be like, I don't know how to use this. And then there'd be like a strategy process that would do a totally different context analysis, or like, and so they just weren't coming together. And I think that was like, maybe we weren't always being clear about like, this is actually when you use it and how, and let's make it simple for this stuff that you need to do. So we're in the process of trying to develop a framework that ties those things together. It's actually really quite, it's really tricky. And then the third piece around capacity is like, so I think, I mentioned some of our offices, I think because of the places they work in, just I think and also just the people that work there or for whatever reason are sort of politically minded, and they work in that way. And so just commissioning a PEA, that works fine. So for example, our office in Ukraine, they developed they commissioned a political economy analysis that they've used really well. And they're like so brilliant in how they've deployed that. But I think for others, like where it's maybe newer or more nascent, or just like, you've got like a really low, you've got a lot of eggs that you're, trying to juggle. I don't know if that's the expression. They are more like, I think for them, doing a PEA is the best way for them to learn. Like, I think for them, like, even if it's an imperfect PEA, I feel that they'll use it better if they go through the process of like doing one, because then it's like, oh, I get what this is saying. I understand why it's telling me that. And so I think that's sort of a long way to say is what we're trying to do is go through the messy process, the sort of lengthy process of supporting teams to do their own political economy analysis as a mechanism to start to do that. So we have this mentorship pilot that we've run now. It's about to start, or it's sort of midway through its third round, where we support two offices to do and apply a PEA through a sort of an accompaniment model. And it takes a year. And I can tell you all about how that's going. And like, there's still lots of challenges. And I think the idea is to try to move that towards also a peer-to-peer model to sort of get some of those economies of scale and sort of move towards, like disseminating it to the extent that we get more of that sort of thinking and working politically approach.
Yeah, Micol, thank you. That's actually fascinating because it touches on a lot of things that seem to be relevant way beyond the experience of WWF. So this thing that you were saying about how to make the analysis relevant to people's day-to-day work so that it doesn't become something that is yet another imposition of yet another framework of yet, because there's so many different types of guidance that have to be applied. So I would be very curious to hear when you know that this is actually becoming embedded as a lens that is intuitive and internalized, rather than as people feeling, oh my God, here they come again with some other kind of new framework, and we've already done the conflict one, and we had to do the Jesse one, and we're doing this one. How do you make it accessible and simple in the way that you describe is really, I would love to hear that. But also I'm very interested in hearing about this mentoring mechanism you're talking about, because part of what we have always been saying as well is that it's not enough to just have the guidance sitting there. There has to be some kind of accompanying process to bring people along the journey, and what that looks like in practice from what you have been doing would be really interesting just to hear about. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do think for like a lot of people, we throw so much guidance. Like we throw so much guidance at people. And like this is not WWF in particular. I'm sure you as you just said, like, and it's true everywhere I've ever worked. Like we've got a framework for this and that, and then people have to get out and do their job every day. So I think we can do a much better job of stitching them together, you know, so people aren't doing, like, as you said, a JEDC and a conflict analysis and a PEA and, you know, an institutional, like, just, you know, I think there's some really interesting work out there to try to think about some of the relationships between those things and making them easier. In terms of how we know it's being internalized, I mean, like, again, it's an evolution and we're still really early in this process, but I will say that I think through the process of uptake, like when we started this mentorship process, I feel that we had to go out there and find teams that were willing to do this, right? We had to go out there and be like, please, will you give this a go? We think this could be a good fit for you. And now we are like the third iteration around. It's like a pretty competitive process. You know, we get a lot of applicants. We have often, now we've got, our applicants are not just, you know, not only doing it as sort of a project level, but they often involve the process of designing their country strategies or appraising their country strategies. They often now involve their senior leadership. So to me, that tells a story, right? Like, people are seeing value through this and they're thinking, oh, I can see that this is useful for me. You know, it won't be across the board. In terms of how we designed it, I would say we're still iterating on it. And I think something I would definitely say is, like, I can tell you what it looks like broadly, but I think it's really important that it changes depending, like, on discussions between the sort of mentor and the team, because every team works differently. You know, the people are what they have time wise, like, it's just, it really needs to be customized. So it's essentially designed, and also, like, you could do a much better job. Like, we work with the resources that we have, I guess I should say. But in terms of the structure, we ask, like, them to kind of form a small team to begin with that will work on it. So it's not just like one person alone, but it's a sort of team. And we have them assign like 2 team leads that we send on the policy practice course. So we send them off for like 4 months to do like a pretty intense commitment of time to really get into the weeds. And we also ask them, like, every few weeks, if they can, to try to just like share a little bit about what they're learning with the rest of the team. And then, so we kind of call that the learning phase. We also ask everybody in the team, except for those 2, we have an in-house like short course, which is like about 10 hours to take. So we sort of have everybody do that. And then once they've done that learning phase, and we ask them to use that process, that learning phase, to really try to think about the problem statement, you know, to really just, if they can, just come away with a concrete problem statement that they're working towards, which can be refined, but I think that's sort of the goal of the learning phase. And then they go into the mentorship stage, which is sort of punctuated with like 3 to 4 workshops. So we encourage the first one to be in person, but some teams have preferred to have like the second one or have more than one in person.
And it's one mentor, or you have a team of mentors working with that with a team?
It's been a team. It's usually like, so it's usually 2 and sometimes more. And something that we've learned is that it's been so valuable to have somebody with local political economy expertise in that mentorship team, actually. So for instance, we did a mentorship of Sokna, which is the southern Kenya, northern Tanzania landscape. It's quite a big area and actually quite a big team. And we had a team where we had a Tanzanian political economist who's really familiar with that area. And I think just that ability to like know the context and speak Kiswahili, like all of that was really helpful for the team. So just to say, I think that was a really useful lesson. And that's something we've sort of taken into subsequent rounds as well. And so the idea of that first workshop is like, let's gather around and let's come up with like a roadmap. This is how we're going to do, this is the plan for how you're going to do your PEA, right? Let's make sure that we understand the framework. We've got our problem statement, and like, let's go through the process of setting up the steps. And then the team really needs to go away and like do the PEA. That the mentors are there as a sounding board. So if they're like, oh, you know, like, what do I, and one thing I think our offices struggle with is the field research, actually, which is like interesting to know if that's common. It's a tricky one, and doing some of the KIIs, then the idea is they come back together, they look at what they've found, and they try to then think about, okay, well, what does this mean for my theory of change? What does this mean in practice? What do I need to do differently? And then the idea is then to go through the process of applying it and have an opportunity to come back and test that and refine it over the course of the later half. It's always taken longer. That process of actually doing the research and then bringing into the theory of change, it's always taken like the full time, I would say. So we've rarely gotten to that adaptation stage. But that's sort of how we've run it. But again, teams have varied a lot. Like, you know, some have wanted many more short, like, so some have said, okay, rather than have like more interspersed workshops, we actually just want like a 2-hour session every couple of weeks, for example. So there's quite a lot of variation.
So basically, you have the mentors supporting the teams who then need to, I mean, they're doing the analysis because whatever iterations or adjustments need to be made, they're the ones who are going to potentially be leading on those, right? So you're involving them in the analysis so that they have the opportunity to think about how they would need to. That's really interesting. So do you have any kind of example of how actually theories of change, for example, may have been refined or adjusted as a result of this thinking from the teams?
Yeah, I think most of our teams have changed their theories of change. You know, so we've had, you know, a team in Cambodia that's really looked more at shifted the level of their focus based on what they found. Yeah, and sort of similarly, our team in Cameroon, they have, I think that's actually really shifted where the drivers themselves, and so the kind of coalitions that they're forming. We had a PA, and that was not one of our mentorship programs, but in Mexico, that kind of found a real gap in one of the key drivers of the illegal jaguar trade. So we've really found, yeah, that teams, I think they, I mean, but then I feel like I need to caveat it and say it's still early days, right? Because people are bringing these into their theories of change now. And then I think there's that question of like, okay, so how do we operationalize this?
Yeah, so you said the mentorship is in its third iteration, but did it start sort of a year ago or 2 years ago, or when was the first?
Yeah, I guess the first one was probably like 2 years ago.
Okay.
We started and so they run for, you know, at least a year, I would say. So and so they overlap a little bit, but yeah, so the first one we did was in Cameroon and Cambodia, and then the second round was in Saknot, so the southern Kenya, northern Tanzania, and in Laos. And then we have a team in Myanmar and Bolivia who are almost done with their TPP course, and I think just excited to get going at the next stage.
I think we have the closing session next week coming up, so it's happening. But yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me about what you're saying is it's quite intense in terms of both staff time and resources, I imagine, right? Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, it is really intensive, and I think this is something we're trying to think about, because we're thinking a lot. I mean, I think we're trying to think about economies of scale in two ways. Like, one is the resources. Like, there's just no way we have the resources to do this for every team. Like, you know, there's thousands of people that work for WWF. So that's not the pathway to TWP, is probably not mentoring every single person through so we've got to think. And then the other piece is that, yeah, this, like, whether having like one team is going to get the whole office kind of thinking in that way, and how do we start to sort of share that out. So we're now pilot. I mean, one thing we're sort of testing out later this month is a training of trainers, where we've got like a cohort, small numbers of, we've got about 12 colleagues that have been through the mentorship and survived the other side, and we're convening to give them some skills to go on and hopefully do a similar process where they support another team in their office, right? So that they kind of are the ones doing the accompaniment to another team, so that we start to see, and I'm really curious to see how that goes. I'm not sure yet.
If you had like wait, where is it that you see the future? A
Crystal
magical
ball.
crystal ball for your work instilling this sort of politically aware lens in the work of WWF and having it applied. When would you know that you have actually made substantive progress on this? What would you be looking for?
I mean, that's a really hard question. I think it's really in the discussions that you have. And I feel like we're starting to see this already. You know, we see where you start to see when you're having discussions with teams, but also maybe like with country directors or conservation directors where they're, you know, wanting to open the sort of black box of, we see in a lot of theories of change, you know, sort of everything's really complicated. And then there's like one part of it that's like politics, you know, and where that looks a little different in theories of change, looks a little bit more broken down. And where we see like more discussion around that happening I'm not sure. I think it's going to be, I have to say, I think it's probably going to just be more iterative than that. You know what I mean? I think we've got to sort of evolve it. And that's been my experience so far, is that like you start small and you see what you get, and then you kind of say, okay, well, that was interesting. Let's see then where we can build on those successes. And I feel like it's probably going to be a little bit more like that than knowing what the end game is.
That's fair enough. That was a question I sprung on you. It's a challenging one.
No.
But you've shared, I mean, you've shared a few really important things, and I think in the way that you have answered some of the questions that I have posed, you have really talked a little bit of challenges and the opportunities, but also some of the lessons that have emerged. If you had to sort of summarize the key lessons for you from your experience to date at WWF, what would you say these have been in relation to political economy awareness and application?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I really feel like through this experience so far that like it's sort of the old, like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I feel that putting it in the hands of others to do is like, has been the most value, I think has given us the most traction on this space. Letting the people that have to deliver the work own it is, you know, and maybe they won't do it exactly how I would do it or you would do it. But I think thinking of like PEAs as a learning process or as a process rather than a pure outcome has been like something that I would really recommend, and just starting small and trying to just build a bit of momentum.
Amazing. And if you were to have one final word of wisdom for our audience, what would that be?
I guess like I think just to maybe like approach all of these things with humility, like there's a lot of knowledge out there, a lot of things that I know nothing about, and I'm learning a lot as well, and it can be like a reciprocal learning arrangement or dynamic, and yeah, just to be humble in these discussions.
That's really great, Micol. Thank you so much. That was really, really, really valuable to have you share all of these very wonderful and I think very timely insights about how this is done as a process and how it is work in progress, and we're learning as we're doing. So thank you so much for sharing those experiences with us.